The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 12 swung open as Judge Elaine Cartwright walked in with her black robe flowing behind her. Everyone stood up. The bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Cartwright." She nodded and took her seat at the bench, her face calm but her eyes alert and watchful. 20 years of fighting, 20 years of proving herself. Judge Cartwright had walked a path filled with people telling her no at every turn. Growing up in a small house on the east side of town, her parents had worked double shifts to make sure she could study at a good school. Her mother, a nurse, would come home with tired feet but still find time to quiz her on spelling words. Her father, who fixed cars at the local garage, had grease permanently stuck under his fingernails but made sure she had all the books she needed. "You want to be a what?" her high school counselor had asked, laughing a little when she said she wanted to be a judge. "Maybe aim for something more realistic for someone from your background." But Elaine didn't listen. She worked through college, taking on extra jobs to pay the bills. Law school was even harder. She sat in classes where she was often the only black woman, with professors who rarely called on her and classmates who seemed surprised whenever she spoke up with the right answer. "You got lucky," one classmate told her after she ranked top of their class in constitutional law. It wasn't luck. It was Elaine studying until 3 a.m. most nights, reading cases over and over until the words blurred together. As a young lawyer, things didn't get easier. Working as a prosecutor, she watched as white male lawyers with half her experience got promoted faster. She watched judges treat her differently in court. "You need to smile more," her boss once told her. "You come across as angry." "I'm not angry," she had replied. "I'm focused." Year after year, she built her reputation case by case. She never cut corners. She never lost her temper, even when defense attorneys tried to talk over her or when witnesses looked past her to the white male judge. She just worked harder and smarter than everyone else. At 45, Judge Cartwright had finally reached the position she dreamed of since she was a 12-year-old watching legal shows on TV. She became the first black woman to serve as Superior Court judge in a district that had only seen white men in that role for over 100 years. On her first day, she'd touched the smooth wood of the judge's bench and thought of her parents, both gone now but still with her in spirit. "We made it," she had whispered. But being first meant being watched. Being first meant having to be perfect. Any mistake would be blamed not just on her, but would be used as proof that her kind didn't belong on the bench. Some lawyers tested her, asking for special treatment or trying to get away with sloppy work. Some police officers who testified in her court would stand a little too casually, address her a little too informally. Judge Cartwright handled it all with a firm but fair approach that soon earned her respect. Tough but fair became how lawyers described her. "She knows her stuff," was what the court staff said. After 2 years on the bench, most people in the courthouse treated her with the respect her position deserved. Most, but not all. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Judge Cartwright reviewed case files before court began, making notes on legal issues that might come up. Her clerk, Lewis, brought her the day's schedule. "Heavy docket today, Judge," Lewis said. "The Thompson-Droe case is up first, and Officer Reynolds is testifying." "Reynolds." Judge Cartwright paused, pen in midair. "Is that the officer from the North District?" "Yes, ma'am. 15 years on the force, decorated twice." Judge Cartwright nodded slowly. She had heard things about Officer Reynolds, things said in whispers among defense attorneys, things about how he treated suspects who looked a certain way. But she would do what she always did, judge the evidence in front of her, not rumors. She couldn't have known that today would be different. That today, Officer Reynolds would walk into her courtroom and change everything. That his hatred, hidden behind a badge for years, would finally show itself to the world. And that Judge Elaine Cartwright, who had spent her life working within the system, would soon have to decide whether to risk everything she'd worked for in order to fight back. The courtroom fell quiet as the big doors opened. Officer James Reynolds walked in like he owned the place. His uniform was pressed perfectly, his badge shining under the courtroom lights. He'd done this hundreds of times before. Walk in, tell his story, go back to work. Easy. "The prosecution calls Officer James Reynolds," said District Attorney Wilson, a thin man with glasses who nodded respectfully toward the judge's bench. Officer Reynolds moved toward the witness stand, his footsteps heavy on the old wooden floor. He didn't look at Judge Cartwright as he was sworn in, keeping his eyes on the court clerk instead. 15 years with the department, is that correct? D.A. Wilson asked after the basic questions about Reynolds' name and position were out of the way. Yes, sir. 15 years next month, Reynolds answered, his voice deep and clear. Everyone could hear the pride in it. Been with narcotics for the last 7. And you've received commendations for your work. Reynolds straightened his back a bit more. 2 medals of valor and 3 commendations for outstanding service. From her seat at the bench, Judge Cartwright watched him carefully. She'd seen his type before, officers who'd been on the force so long they started believing they were above questioning. She looked down at the case file open in front of her, reading her notes about the drug arrest that had brought them all here today. Can you tell us about the night of January 12th when you arrested the defendant, Mr. Thompson? The DA continued. We have been watching that neighborhood for weeks, Reynolds began, looking at the jury now. Known drug area. Got a tip about activity at that house. I was patrolling with my partner when we saw a man who matched the description of our suspect. Judge Cartwright listened as Reynolds described pulling over Thompson's car, claiming he'd run a stop sign. He talked about seeing something suspicious in the car that gave him probable cause to search. And that's when you found the drugs? Wilson asked. Yes, sir. Hidden under the driver's seat. Street value of about $5,000. The defense attorney, a young woman named Patricia Chen, stood up for cross-examination. Judge Cartwright noticed how Reynolds' face changed slightly when Chen approached, a small tightening around his mouth, a slight narrowing of his eyes. Officer Reynolds, Chen began, you mentioned you had a tip about this house. Do you have documentation of this tip? Reynolds shifted in his seat. It was a confidential informant. We don't always document every conversation. I see. And this stop sign my client allegedly ran, is there any video evidence of this from your dash cam? Camera was malfunctioning that day, Reynolds said, his voice getting a little harder. Judge Cartwright leaned forward slightly. This was the 3rd case she'd had where Officer Reynolds claimed his camera wasn't working. Officer, Judge Cartwright interrupted, your report states you had clear view of the drugs from outside the vehicle, which gave you probable cause for the search. But the photographs showed they were completely hidden under the seat. Can you explain that discrepancy? Reynolds finally looked directly at Judge Cartwright. Something cold flashed in his eyes. I could see the corner of the bag sticking out, Your Honor, he said, putting a strange emphasis on Your Honor that didn't sound respectful at all. That's not evident in any of the photographs, Judge Cartwright pointed out. Things get moved during an arrest situation, Reynolds said with a shrug. Maybe it got kicked further under when he was getting out of the car. So to be clear, Judge Cartwright pressed, your testimony is that you could see the drugs, but then they became hidden under the seat during the arrest. That's correct, Miss, Reynolds said, dropping the Your Honor completely. A slight murmur ran through the courtroom. Everyone knew judges were always addressed as Your Honor. You will address this court properly as Your Honor, Judge Cartwright said calmly. Reynolds stared at her for a beat too long before saying, Yes, Your Honor, in a tone that sounded like anything but honor. The questioning continued, with more holes appearing in Reynolds' story. Each time Judge Cartwright asked for clarification, Reynolds' answers got shorter, his tone more clipped. When she asked him to explain why the timestamps on his report didn't match the dispatch records, his face flushed red. During a brief pause while the DA searched for a document, Judge Cartwright heard it, a word muttered under Reynolds' breath. A word she'd heard before, whispered behind her back throughout her career. A word filled with hate. She kept her face perfectly still, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing her react. But inside, Judge Cartwright felt something shift. This wasn't just another officer stretching the truth to make a case. This was something deeper, something personal. We'll take a 15-minute recess, she announced, standing up. When we return, Officer Reynolds, I expect clear answers about these inconsistencies. As she walked to her chambers, she could feel Reynolds' eyes burning into her back. The real battle, she knew, was just beginning. The 15-minute break stretched to 20 as Judge Cartwright sat in her chambers, breathing deeply. Her law clerk, Lewis, knocked gently before entering with a cup of tea. You okay, Judge? He asked, placing the steaming cup on her desk. She nodded, though they both knew she wasn't. "I've dealt with worse," she said simply. When Judge Cartwright returned to the courtroom, she noticed Officer Reynolds had unbuttoned his top collar button. A small thing, but it showed his growing frustration. The room fell silent as she took her seat. "Court is back in session," she announced, her voice steady. "Before we continue with Officer Reynolds' testimony, I need to address some concerns about the evidence in this case." She looked down at her notes, carefully choosing her words. "Based on the testimony and evidence presented, I am ruling that the search of Mr. Thompson's vehicle appears to have been conducted without proper probable cause." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The district attorney's face fell. "Any evidence obtained from that search," Judge Cartwright continued, "will not be admissible in these proceedings." She looked up and saw Officer Reynolds' face had turned a dark shade of red. His eyes had narrowed to slits, and his hands were clenched into fists on the witness stand. "Your Honor," the district attorney began, "if I could just—" But he never finished his sentence. Officer Reynolds shot to his feet. "This is bull," he shouted, his voice booming through the courtroom. "Absolute bull." The bailiff stepped forward, but Reynolds ignored him. "You're throwing out solid evidence because of some technicality." Judge Cartwright hit her gavel once. "Officer Reynolds, you will control yourself in my courtroom." "Your courtroom?" Reynolds laughed, a harsh sound without any humor in it. "Oh, that's right. They gave you a courtroom, didn't they?" The district attorney stood up. "Officer, please." But Reynolds was already moving, stepping down from the witness stand. "I've been putting away drug dealers for 15 years while you were, what? Getting ahead because they needed to fill some quota." The courtroom froze in shocked silence. Even the defendant and his lawyer seemed stunned. "Officer Reynolds," Judge Cartwright said, her voice like steel, "you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please remove." "I'm not finished," Reynolds shouted, moving toward the bench now. The bailiff rushed forward, but Reynolds was faster, his long legs carrying him quickly across the wooden floor. "I won't be lectured about the law by some affirmative action hire." His words hung in the air like poison. Judge Cartwright didn't flinch. She'd heard these words before, though rarely so openly, so publicly. "You are finished, officer," she said calmly. "And you have just ended your career." Something in her calm seemed to push Reynolds over the edge. He lunged the last few steps to her bench, slamming his hands down on the polished wood. "You people always stick together," he snarled, leaning in so close that Judge Cartwright could smell the coffee on his breath. His eyes were wild now, filled with a hatred he'd probably carried his whole life. Letting criminals walk while good cops get thrown under the bus. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The bailiff finally reached Reynolds, grabbing his arm, but Reynolds shook him off violently. 2 more court officers rushed in from the side door. The defendant's family gasped. Someone screamed. Through it all, Judge Cartwright remained seated, her back straight, her eyes locked with Reynolds. She didn't look away, didn't shrink back, even as he towered over her. "Get him out of my courtroom," she ordered, her voice somehow cutting through the noise. It took 3 court officers to drag Reynolds away from the bench. He fought them the whole way, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he shouted as they pushed him toward the door. Only when the doors closed behind them did Judge Cartwright realize that her heart was pounding. Her hands, hidden beneath her bench, were shaking, but her face gave nothing away. She looked out at the stunned faces in her courtroom, the jurors, the attorneys, the spectators, the court reporter who had captured every word. She noticed several people holding up cell phones. The whole incident had been recorded not just by the official court system, but by ordinary citizens. "This court will take a 1-hour recess," she announced, amazed at how normal her voice sounded. "When we return, Mr. District Attorney, I'll hear your case for continuing without the excluded evidence if you wish to proceed." As Judge Cartwright stood to leave, she caught the eye of an elderly black woman sitting in the back row. The woman gave her a small nod of respect. It was the smallest gesture, but somehow it helped steady her. In her chambers, Judge Cartwright finally let herself feel the weight of what had just happened. But along with the shock and anger came something else: determination. Officer Reynolds had just shown his true face to the world, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. Judge Cartwright closed the door to her chambers and finally let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled as she placed them flat on her desk, leaned forward and closing her eyes for a moment. A knock on the door made her straighten up quickly. "Come in," she called, her voice surprisingly steady. Lewis, her clerk, entered with the court reporter, Anna, behind him. Both looked shaken. "Judge, are you all right?" Lewis asked, concern written across his face. "We can call for security to stay outside your chambers if you'd like." "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't. "Not really. Is everyone okay out there?" "They've taken Officer Reynolds to a holding cell downstairs," Anna said. "He was still yelling when they got him in the elevator." Judge Cartwright nodded. "Anna, I'll need a transcript of everything that happened as soon as possible." "Already working on it," Anna promised. "Every word is recorded." Another knock at the door. This time it was the chief judge of the courthouse, Judge William Henderson, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair. Behind him stood Police Chief Davis and District Attorney Wilson. "Elaine," Henderson said, dropping formalities, "this is a disaster. Everyone's phone has been ringing off the hook. There's already video on social media." "Hello, gentlemen," Judge Cartwright said, gesturing for them to sit. None of them did. "Judge Cartwright," Police Chief Davis began, his face a careful mask of concern. "On behalf of the department, I want to offer our sincere apologies for Officer Reynolds' behavior. It was completely unacceptable and doesn't reflect our values." The words sounded rehearsed, empty. "I appreciate that, Chief," she replied coolly. "What happens now?" Chief Davis cleared his throat. "Well, Officer Reynolds has been detained. He'll face administrative leave while we conduct an internal review." "An internal review?" Judge Cartwright raised an eyebrow. "He committed contempt of court, made threatening advances toward a judge, and used racist language in front of dozens of witnesses. You're talking about an internal review." "Now, Elaine," Henderson cut in, "we all need to take a breath here. This situation could get very messy very quickly." "It's already messy, Bill," she replied. District Attorney Wilson stepped forward. "Judge Cartwright, we're all on the same side here. None of us condones what Officer Reynolds did, but a public spectacle won't help anyone." Judge Cartwright looked at the three men standing before her, all in positions of power, all looking uncomfortable, all hoping she would help them make this problem go away quietly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked, though she already knew. Chief Davis spoke carefully. "Officer Reynolds has a spotless record until now, 15 years of service, decorated twice. He clearly had some kind of breakdown today. We can handle this administratively. A reprimand, some time off, maybe reassignment. And sensitivity training," Henderson added quickly. "Lots of that." Judge Cartwright almost laughed. "Sensitivity training? For a man who called me an affirmative action hire and said you people always stick together in open court." She shook her head. "No." The three men exchanged glances. "What do you mean, no?" Henderson asked. "I mean, no, I won't help you sweep this under the rug," she said simply. "Officer Reynolds committed multiple offenses today, and I intend to see that he faces appropriate consequences." "Elaine," Henderson lowered his voice, "be reasonable. Think about the department. Think about the court. This kind of publicity isn't good for anyone." "This isn't about publicity, girl. This is about justice." She stood up straighter. "And it's not just about what happened to me today. If an officer feels entitled to behave that way toward a judge in open court, how does he treat ordinary citizens when no one's watching?" The room fell silent. Chief Davis looked at his shoes. D.A. Wilson adjusted his tie. "I'll be filing formal charges," Judge Cartwright continued. "And I'll be requesting a full investigation into Officer Reynolds' conduct and case history." "You can't be serious," Henderson said. "I've never been more serious in my life." The chief judge sighed. "This won't be easy, Elaine. The police union will fight you every step of the way. And there are elements in this community who won't take kindly to a black judge going after a white officer." "I'm well aware of that," she replied. "But I didn't become a judge because it was easy. I became a judge to uphold the law. That's what I intend to do." As the men filed out of her chambers, looking defeated, Judge Cartwright sank into her chair. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted. She knew what was coming, the fight, the backlash, the threats. She'd seen it happen to others. but she also knew she couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Saw the video. You okay? Judge Cartwright took a deep breath. The battle was just beginning. 3 days after the courtroom incident, Judge Cartwright sat at her dining room table surrounded by stacks of paper. The formal complaints she'd filed against Officer Reynolds had set things in motion, but she wasn't about to sit back and wait. This can't be right, she muttered, flipping through a report her friend in the public defender's office had sent over. According to these records, there had been 6 complaints of excessive force filed against Reynolds in the past 3 years. All 6 had been dismissed without investigation. Her doorbell rang, making her jump. These days, every unexpected sound put her on edge. She peeked through the curtains before opening the door. "Thanks for coming," she said as Diane Washington stepped inside. Diane was the head public defender in the county, a tough lawyer who had faced off against Judge Cartwright many times when Elaine was still a prosecutor. "Are you kidding? I've been waiting years for someone to take on Reynolds," Diane said, dropping a heavy file box on the dining room table. "We've suspected something was off with his arrests for a long time, but could never prove it." They spent hours going through case files, arrest reports, and complaint forms. A pattern began to emerge, one that made Judge Cartwright's stomach turn. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a spreadsheet Diane had compiled. Reynolds made 243 arrests in the last 2 years. 78% were black or Latino drivers stopped for minor traffic violations that somehow turned into drug arrests. Diane nodded grimly. And in most of those cases, the drugs were in plain sight, or he claimed he smelled marijuana, reasons that can't be disproven later. "Especially if there's no body camera footage," Judge Cartwright added, thinking of the malfunctioning camera Reynolds had mentioned in her courtroom. The more they dug, the worse it looked. Reynolds had an unusually high rate of finding contraband during routine traffic stops, but only when the drivers were people of color. When the drivers were white, his hunches rarely paid off. Judge Cartwright pushed back from the table, rubbing her tired eyes. "We need to look at his dashcam records. See how many times his camera conveniently malfunctioned during these stops." "That won't be easy," Diane warned. "The department guards those records carefully." "I know someone who can help," Judge Cartwright said, reaching for her phone. 2 days later, she met with Thomas Franklin, a court clerk who worked in records. They sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop far from the courthouse. "What you're asking for could get me fired," Thomas said nervously, glancing around the nearly empty shop. "I know, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important," Judge Cartwright replied. "But this goes beyond one officer losing his temper in court. People's lives and freedom are at stake." Thomas slid a USB drive across the table. 3 years of equipment malfunction reports from the police department. "I can't believe I'm doing this." "You're doing the right thing," she assured him. That night, the data confirmed their suspicions. Officer Reynolds had reported camera malfunctions 26 times in the past 3 years, all during stops that resulted in arrests of minority drivers. The department's other officers averaged just 2 to 3 malfunctions per year. "This can't be coincidence," Judge Cartwright told Diane over the phone. "It's not," Diane agreed. "And I think I found something even bigger. Remember the Thompson case that started all this? I pulled the GPS data from Reynolds' patrol car that night. He wasn't anywhere near that stop sign where he claimed Thompson ran it. He followed Thompson from his cousin's house for 3 miles before pulling him over." Judge Cartwright felt a chill. He targeted him. "Exactly. And I bet if we check the GPS data on his other random stops, we'll find the same thing." The next morning, Judge Cartwright received a call from an unfamiliar number. "Is this Judge Cartwright?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Angela Wilson. I saw what happened in your courtroom with that officer. The video is everywhere." She paused. 3 years ago, Officer Reynolds arrested my son, Deander. Claimed he found drugs in his car during a traffic stop. My boy swore they weren't his, that Reynolds planted them, but nobody believed him." Judge Cartwright's heart beat faster. "Where is your son now, Mrs. Wilson?" "Serving 5 years, the woman said, her voice breaking. He was 19 when they took him away. First-time offense, but the amount of drugs Reynolds found triggered mandatory minimums. By the end of the week, 4 more families had reached out with similar stories. Each case followed the same pattern. Reynolds making a stop for a minor violation, finding drugs in places that wouldn't be caught on camera even if it had been working, and the word of a white officer against that of a young person of color. "We need to get all these cases reopened," Judge Cartwright told Diane. "It won't be easy," Diane warned. The DA's office has built their drug conviction rates on Reynolds' arrests. They won't want to admit they've been prosecuting bad cases for years. Judge Cartwright stared at the wall of evidence they'd assembled in her dining room. They won't have a choice, not anymore. The morning news blared from Judge Cartwright's kitchen TV as she made her coffee. She stopped mid-pour when she heard her name. Controversy continues to swirl around Superior Court Judge Elaine Cartwright's crusade against decorated police officer James Reynolds, the news anchor said. The police union held a press conference yesterday defending Officer Reynolds. The screen cut to Frank Morris, the head of the police union, standing at a podium surrounded by officers. "What we're seeing is a witch hunt," Morris declared. "Officer Reynolds has protected this community for 15 years. One bad day shouldn't erase that record. Judge Cartwright clearly has an agenda, and Officer Reynolds is being sacrificed for it." Judge Cartwright's phone rang. It was Diane. "Are you watching this garbage?" Diane asked without saying hello. Unfortunately, Judge Cartwright sighed. "It's just the beginning." She was right. By afternoon, conservative talk radio hosts were calling her an activist judge and questioning her qualifications. One even suggested she had connections to anti-police groups without offering any evidence. Later that day, Judge Cartwright's sister called, worry in her voice. "Elaine, have you seen the comments online? People are saying terrible things. Some are even making threats." "I know," Judge Cartwright said quietly. She'd already received 2 threatening emails that morning. Court security had recommended she vary her routes to work. That evening, Judge Henderson summoned her to his office. His usually friendly face was tight with stress. "This has gone too far, Elaine," he said, dropping a stack of papers on his desk. "These are requests from defense attorneys asking you to recuse yourself from any cases involving police testimony. They're claiming you're biased against law enforcement." "That's ridiculous," she said. "Is it? You've been very public about this Reynolds situation." "I haven't said a word publicly," she countered. "Everything I've done has been through proper channels." Henderson sighed. "The videos from your courtroom went viral. Everyone has seen Reynolds' outburst. And now these investigations you're pushing for. It looks like you have an axe to grind." "Following proper procedure to address misconduct is not having an axe to grind," she said firmly. "And I won't recuse myself from cases simply because I expect officers to tell the truth under oath." As she left his office, a reporter was waiting in the hallway. "Judge Cartwright, can we get a comment about Officer Reynolds? The police union says you're targeting him unfairly." She kept walking, saying nothing. She'd been around long enough to know that answering would only feed the fire. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her house felt too quiet, too empty. The online comments her sister mentioned kept playing in her mind. She should be removed from the bench. Another angry black woman causing trouble. Who does she think she is? Her phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Turn on Channel 4 now." Judge Cartwright flipped on the TV to see Reynolds' wife speaking tearfully to a reporter. "My husband has served this community faithfully. Now he can't even go to the grocery store without people recognizing him from those videos. How children are suffering." The reporter turned to the camera. "The Reynolds family says Officer Reynolds has received death threats since Judge Cartwright's accusations." Judge Cartwright switched off the TV, feeling sick. This wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want anyone threatened, not Reynolds, not his family. She just wanted the truth to come out. The next morning, she made a decision. She called an old friend who worked at the local newspaper. "I need to talk," she said, not as a judge commenting on a pending case, but about the broader issues at play here. 2 days later, the Sunday paper ran a front-page interview. Judge Cartwright had been careful, never mentioning Reynolds by name or commenting on his specific case. Instead, she spoke thoughtfully about the importance of accountability in the justice system. When someone puts on a uniform or takes an oath, they're given tremendous power, she was quoted saying. With that power comes responsibility. If we don't hold everyone in the system accountable, judges, prosecutors, police officers, then justice becomes impossible. She also talked about her own journey. I became a judge because I believe in the law. I believe it can protect all of us, but only if it's applied fairly and equally. That's not a radical position. That's the foundation of our entire legal system. The interview struck a chord. By evening, it had been shared thousands of times online. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own experiences with law enforcement, good and bad. A local civil rights group announced a rally in support of Judge Cartwright. Meanwhile, the police union planned a counter-demonstration. The small controversy had become a flashpoint for larger tensions in the community. Through it all, Judge Cartwright kept showing up to work, hearing cases, making rulings. She didn't ask for this fight, but she wasn't backing down. Not when so much was at stake. 6 months seemed both incredibly long and surprisingly short to Judge Cartwright. Half a year of investigations, hearings, and public debate. Half a year of extra security and changing her routines. Half a year of fighting a system that desperately wanted to protect one of its own. She sat in her office, staring at the thick report that had just been delivered. The Independent Commission had finally completed their investigation into Officer Reynolds' conduct. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. 3 hours later, she was still reading when Lewis knocked on her door. "Judge, the press conference is about to start." She nodded, gathering her things. "Thank you, Lewis, for everything." He smiled. "You did the right thing, Judge, no matter what happens next." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews. At the top stood Mayor Chen, Police Commissioner Taylor, and the head of the Independent Commission, Dr. Rosenberg. Judge Cartwright took her place among them, feeling strangely calm. Mayor Chen stepped to the microphones first. 6 months ago, an incident in our courthouse shocked our community and sparked important conversations about accountability in our justice system. Today, we're here to share the findings of the Independent Commission that has been investigating the conduct of Officer James Reynolds. Dr. Rosenberg stepped forward next, her gray hair blowing in the light breeze. Our commission has spent the past 6 months conducting a thorough investigation, reviewing hundreds of cases, interviewing dozens of witnesses, and analyzing years of data. Our findings are detailed in this report, which will be made public today. She adjusted her glasses. What we found was deeply troubling. Not only did we substantiate Judge Cartwright's account of Officer Reynolds' behavior in her courtroom, but we uncovered a pattern of misconduct spanning his 15-year career. A murmur ran through the crowd of reporters. Officer Reynolds targeted minority drivers at rates far exceeding statistical norms. He reported equipment malfunctions during critical arrests at 10 times the rate of his peers. And most disturbing, we found substantial evidence suggesting he may have falsified evidence in at least 17 cases. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Judge Cartwright kept her face neutral, though inside she felt a complex mix of vindication and sadness. No victory could undo the damage Reynolds had done to so many lives. Commissioner Taylor stepped up next, looking uncomfortable but resigned. Based on these findings, the department has terminated Officer Reynolds' employment, effective immediately. We will also be implementing new training and oversight procedures to ensure that this kind of misconduct is caught much earlier. He cleared his throat. Additionally, the District Attorney's Office will be reviewing all convictions based primarily on Officer Reynolds' testimony or evidence he collected. Those wrongfully convicted will have their cases reopened. Judge Cartwright thought of Angela Wilson's son, serving time for drugs Reynolds likely planted in his car. Soon he might be coming home. When it was her turn to speak, Judge Cartwright kept her comments brief and focused on the future. "Today isn't about one officer or one judge," she said. "It's about recommitting ourselves to the principles of justice and equality under the law. Every person who enters a courtroom deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of their race, background, or position. That's the promise of our justice system, a promise we must work every day to fulfill." After the press conference, Judge Cartwright slipped away from the reporters shouting questions. She had a more important meeting to attend. In a small conference room at the courthouse, 5 young black law students waited nervously. They'd reached out after reading about her stand against Reynolds, asking if she might speak to their study group. "Thank you for coming," one young woman said as Judge Cartwright entered. "You've inspired all of us." Judge Cartwright smiled, suddenly feeling the weight of the past 6 months. The path won't be easy, she told them honestly. There will be days when you question whether it's worth the fight. Was it worth it? Asked one of the students. Judge Cartwright thought about the 17 cases being reopened, about the new accountability measures being implemented in the police department, about the message sent to officers like Reynolds who thought their badge placed them above the law. Yes, she said simply. Justice is always worth fighting for. Later that evening, Judge Cartwright received an envelope. Inside was the State Bar Association's annual Courage in Justice Award notification. She set it aside and instead opened her email, reading through the dozens of messages that had arrived since the press conference. Most were from ordinary citizens thanking her for standing firm. One in particular caught her eye, from a public defender in another state who wrote, "Today, I told my client, a young black man facing questionable charges, about your victory." For the first time since his arrest, he smiled. He said, "So the system can work sometimes. Thank you for giving him that hope." Judge Cartwright closed her laptop and looked out her window at the city below. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But today, at least, justice had won around.